She was supposed to be walking down the aisle in 6 hours, but instead she stood frozen in a doorway watching her billionaire fiancé destroy everything she believed about love. Don't scroll past this. Your heart led you here for a reason. Beautiful souls, I'm Mr. Daniel, and this isn't just a channel, it's your family. Today's story might be exactly what your soul needed to hear. If you feel the calling, comment, "I'm ready, Mr. Daniel," and let's begin this journey together. Your one comment keeps our family's heartbeat alive. Don't just watch, become part of something greater. She carried coffee to her fiancé's room at 6 a.m., expecting to find the love of her life. Instead, she discovered the greatest performance of her best friend's career. Zara Manning slipped through the marble hallways of the Napa Valley estate like a ghost in silk. Her bare feet made no sound against the cool floors as she balanced 2 steaming cups of Marcus's favorite Colombian blend. The $50 million vineyard stretched endlessly beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, morning mist clinging to the vines like gossamer veils. In 6 hours, 300 of the world's most powerful people would gather here to witness what everyone believed would be the wedding of the decade. The Harvard law graduate had awakened before dawn, too excited to sleep. After 18 months of planning, today would finally make her Mrs. Marcus Chen, wife to Silicon Valley's youngest tech billionaire. She'd grown up in a cramped Birmingham apartment where her mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Now she lived in a world where champagne cost more than her family's monthly rent, where private jets waited like taxis, where love seemed as limitless as Marcus's bank account. She paused outside his suite, hearing voices through the heavy oak door. Marcus must be on an early conference call with Tokyo investors. He never stopped working, not even on their wedding day. That drive had built his empire, but sometimes she wondered if success had cost him the ability to simply be present. "You really think she doesn't suspect anything?" The voice belonged to Brittany Walsh, her maid of honor since college. Zara's hand froze on the door handle. "She's too trusting," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "Zara sees the best in everyone. It's what I love about her, but it makes this easier. And after today," Brittany's laugh held no warmth. "When she finds out about the recordings, about everything we've planned—" "She'll be destroyed," Marcus said quietly. "But by then it won't matter. The prenup will protect everything, and she'll be too humiliated to fight back. You've made sure of that." The coffee cup slipped from Zara's numb fingers, crashing against marble with the sound of her world shattering. Hot liquid splashed across expensive silk, but she barely felt it. Through the crack in the door, she could see Brittany in Marcus's arms, her wedding dress hanging forgotten in the corner, while her best friend wore nothing but Marcus's shirt. "I still can't believe you got her to trust me with all those private conversations," Brittany continued, running her fingers through Marcus's hair. "Recording her talking about her family's debts, her insecurities, her fears about not being good enough for you. It's perfect ammunition for the humiliation phase." "The plan has to work," Marcus said, his voice strained. "My investors are getting nervous about the company's real numbers. If Zara finds out about the losses before we're married, if she realizes the prenup is designed to trap her assets instead of protecting mine, everything falls apart." Zara backed away from the door, her legal mind racing despite the emotional devastation. Marcus wasn't the successful billionaire everyone believed. He needed her money, her connections, her family's construction company that she'd inherited when her father died. The romance, the proposal under a blanket of stars in Tuscany, the whispered promises of forever, it had all been a performance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brittany. "Can't wait to see your face when you find out the truth. Sweet dreams, bride-to-be." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She hadn't found the truth yet. She'd only glimpsed the surface of a conspiracy that ran deeper than infidelity. But as she stood in that hallway, silk robe stained with coffee and tears, something shifted inside her. The trusting woman who'd believed in fairy tale love was gone. In her place stood someone much more dangerous, a Harvard-trained lawyer who'd just discovered she was being played by amateurs. Have you ever had a moment where your entire reality shifted in seconds, when everything you believed proved to be a lie? The strength it takes to survive that kind of betrayal is something most people never understand. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing. The woman who graduated top of her class at Harvard Law didn't cry when her world collapsed. She started collecting evidence. Zara moved through the estate like a woman possessed, but not by grief, by purpose. While her heart screamed in anguish, her mind had already shifted into the cold, calculated mode that had made her the youngest partner at Birmingham's most prestigious law firm. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she had less than 5 hours to unravel a conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything she'd built. The main house felt different now, its opulent rooms transformed from a fairy tale setting into a crime scene. She made her way to Marcus's home office, knowing he never locked it because he trusted her completely. The irony tasted bitter as she slipped inside and began photographing documents with methodical precision. Her phone buzzed with a call from Judge Patricia Williams, her mentor from law school. "Zara, honey, I know it's your wedding day, but something's been bothering me about those investment papers you asked me to review last month." "Tell me everything," Zara said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Marcus's company financials don't add up. The revenue reports show massive profits, but the tax filings tell a different story. Unless I'm missing something, Chen Technologies is hemorrhaging money. The man you're marrying today might be worth less than the paper his stock certificates are printed on." Zara's fingers stilled over the camera as pieces clicked into place. "Patricia, what would happen if someone married into debt, thinking they were marrying into wealth? With the right prenup, they'd be trapped, legally responsible for debts they never knew existed, while their own assets became collateral." Patricia's voice sharpened with understanding. "Zara, please tell me you had independent legal counsel review your prenup." "I trusted him," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I signed whatever he put in front of me because I thought love meant trust." "Oh, sweetheart." Patricia's maternal instincts kicked in across the phone line. "What are you going to do?" Zara stared at the contracts spread across Marcus's mahogany desk, her legal training taking over where her heart had failed. "I'm going to do what you taught me, Patricia. I'm going to win." For the next hour, she moved through the office like a surgeon, extracting evidence with precision. Bank statements showing massive debt hidden behind shell companies. Email chains discussing the Manning acquisition. They were talking about her like a corporate takeover. Investment agreements that would collapse the moment investors discovered the truth about Chen Technologies' real value. But the most damaging discovery came in a folder marked Insurance Policy. Inside were detailed psychological profiles of her, compiled by Brittany over months of friendship. Her fears about not being worthy of Marcus's world, her guilt about her family's working-class background, her desperate desire to prove she belonged among the elite. They'd mapped her vulnerabilities like generals planning a war. The phone call that changed everything came at 9 a.m. Marcus's name appeared on her screen, and she answered with the same sweet voice he'd fallen in love with. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, but she could hear the strain beneath his charm. "We need to talk before the ceremony. Brittany told me something about you that I need to understand." "What kind of something?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "She says you've been lying about your family's company, that the construction business is worthless, that you're marrying me for money." His voice broke slightly. "I don't want to believe it, but she has recordings, Zara. She has proof." Zara almost laughed at the beautiful simplicity of it. They were going to accuse her of exactly what they were doing, using her own honesty against her. In those recordings, she'd probably expressed doubts about fitting into his world, worries about being enough for someone so successful. Brittany had twisted her vulnerability into evidence of deception. "Marcus," she said softly, "I love you. Whatever Brittany told you, we can work through it together. That's what couples do." "I hope so," he said, relief evident in his voice. I can't lose you, Zara. Not today. Not ever. When someone betrays you, do you fight or do you strategize? What's your first instinct when everything falls apart? I want you to think about that as you hear what happened next, because Zara's choice changed everything. The irony was perfect. He had no idea she already knew everything. As she hung up the phone, she realized Marcus and Brittany had made one critical error. They'd underestimated exactly who they were trying to destroy. This wasn't just any trusting woman in love. This was a Harvard-trained prosecutor who'd built her career on taking down people who thought they were untouchable. She decided to give the performance of her lifetime, and the audience had no idea they were about to witness the most expensive divorce before the marriage even began. Zara stared at her reflection in the bridal suite's ornate mirror, watching stylists transform her into the radiant bride everyone expected to see. The $30,000 custom gown flowed around her like liquid moonlight, its hand-sewn pearls catching the morning sun streaming through crystal-clear windows. To everyone else, she looked like a woman living her fairy tale. Only she knew she was preparing for war. "You look absolutely stunning," gushed Sarah, the lead stylist, as she adjusted the cathedral-length veil. "Marcus is going to lose his breath when he sees you." "I certainly hope so," Zara replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Around the suite, her bridesmaids chattered excitedly, their champagne glasses catching the light like tiny weapons. None of them suspected that beneath her serene exterior, she was recording every conversation, gathering evidence with the patience of a seasoned prosecutor. Brittany swept into the room wearing her maid of honor dress, a vision in dusty rose silk that perfectly complemented her blonde hair. She looked every inch the loyal best friend, but Zara now saw the calculation behind her bright smile, the way her eyes assessed every detail with predatory intensity. "The bride glowing with happiness," Brittany announced, raising her champagne flute, to Zara, who's about to get everything she's ever dreamed of. The other bridesmaids giggled and toasted, unaware of the double meaning in Brittany's words. Zara raised her own glass, playing her part perfectly. "To friendship," she said, meeting Brittany's eyes directly. "To the people who really know us." "Speaking of knowing each other," Brittany said, settling beside her with practiced casualness, "I hope you're ready for some surprises today. Marriage has a way of revealing truths we never expected." "I'm sure it does," Zara agreed, her voice warm with false innocence. "I can't wait to see what revelations today brings." The phone hidden in her bouquet captured every word as Brittany continued her psychological games, each comment designed to plant seeds of doubt and insecurity. But instead of the vulnerable woman they'd profiled, Brittany was now facing someone who understood manipulation tactics better than she did. As the morning progressed, Zara played her part flawlessly. She laughed at the right moments, cried happy tears when her mother arrived with her grandmother's diamond earrings, and graciously accepted well-wishes from family members who'd traveled across the country to celebrate what they believed was the happiest day of her life. "I remember when you first told me about Marcus," her mother said, adjusting the delicate earrings. "You lit up like Christmas morning. I haven't seen you that happy since your father was alive." The mention of her father sent a sharp pang through Zara's chest. He would have seen through Marcus immediately, would have demanded to review every contract before walking her down any aisle. But he was gone, and she'd been so desperate to believe in love again that she'd ignored every red flag. "He made me believe in fairy tales," Zara said, the words carrying a truth that only she understood now. At 11 a.m., Marcus called again, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Zara, I need to see you before the ceremony. There are things we need to discuss, decisions we need to make together." "Darling, you know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," she replied sweetly. "Whatever it is can wait until we're husband and wife. Then we'll have forever to share everything." The silence on his end stretched long enough that she wondered if he might confess everything. But Marcus had spent too many years building his image to crumble now. "You're right," he finally said. "I love you, Zara, more than you know." "I love you too," she replied, meaning something entirely different than he imagined. After hanging up, she noticed Brittany watching her with sharp eyes. "Everything okay? You seem different today. More controlled." "It's my wedding day," Zara replied with a serene smile. "I've never felt more like myself." The photographer captured dozens of shots of the bridal party getting ready, each image a perfect representation of joy and celebration. But if anyone looked closely at Zara's eyes, they might have noticed something that didn't belong in a fairy tale: the cold, calculating stare of a predator who'd been underestimated by her prey. Have you ever had to pretend everything was fine while your world was crumbling? The strength that takes is unimaginable. The ability to smile and laugh and play your part while planning your survival requires a kind of courage most people never develop. Drop a heart if you've been there, if you know what it feels like to perform happiness while your soul is breaking. As noon approached and the guests began arriving, Zara made her final preparations. Hidden microphones, backup recordings, legal documents she'd prepared in the early morning hours. Everything was in place for the performance of her lifetime. When Brittany leaned close as they prepared to head downstairs, her whisper carried the confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. "I hope you're ready for the surprise of your life." Zara smiled serenely and whispered back, "I hope you are too." Neither woman knew that Marcus was about to make a confession that would change both their plans forever. But as Zara took her father's place at the top of the grand staircase, she realized that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from trusting others, but from finally learning to trust yourself. Every step down the aisle brought her closer to the moment when 300 guests would witness the truth that could destroy 3 lives or set 1 woman free. The wedding march began with the gentle strings of a full orchestra, the melody floating across the vineyard chapel like a promise of forever. Zara stood at the entrance, her arm linked with Judge Patricia Williams, who'd agreed to walk her down the aisle when her father couldn't. Through the open doors, she could see 300 of the world's most powerful people rising to their feet, their faces turned toward her with expressions of admiration and envy. Tech moguls worth billions stood beside Hollywood celebrities and political dynasties, all gathered to witness what the media had dubbed Silicon Valley's wedding of the century. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors imported from Italian quarries, while white roses lined the aisle like fallen snow. Each bloom had cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding. But Zara now understood they weren't decorations. They were props in an elaborate performance designed to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered. "You don't have to do this," Patricia whispered as they paused at the threshold. "We can walk out right now. My car is waiting." "No," Zara replied, her voice steady as steel. "This ends today, but it ends on my terms." The first step down the aisle sent whispers rippling through the crowd. Guests raised phones to capture the moment, unaware they were about to record something far more explosive than a fairy tale wedding. Society photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shot, their cameras clicking like tiny weapons as Zara moved with regal grace toward her waiting groom. Marcus stood at the altar in a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, but Zara could see the guilt written across his handsome features. His hands trembled slightly as she approached, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the perfect temperature. Beside him, his best man shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been asked to play in this deception. "You look breathtaking," Marcus whispered as Patricia placed Zara's hand in his. His touch felt cold, despite the warmth of the day, and she noticed his wedding ring finger bore a tan line where another ring usually sat, probably the one Brittany had been wearing in his bed that morning. "Thank you," she replied, her smile radiant enough to fool the cameras, but cold enough that Marcus's eyes widened with the first hint of uncertainty. The officiant, a celebrity pastor who usually married A-list couples, opened his leather-bound Bible with practiced ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 souls who have found in each other their perfect match." As he continued the traditional opening, Zara scanned the congregation with the careful attention of a prosecutor studying a jury. In the front row, her mother dabbed at happy tears with a lace handkerchief, completely unaware that her daughter's heart was breaking behind the perfect wedding makeup. Marcus's parents sat stiffly in their designer clothes, their expressions revealing nothing of their true feelings about their son's choice of bride. But it was Brittany who commanded her attention. The maid of honor stood just to her left, holding the bridal bouquet with practiced grace, her face a mask of supportive friendship. Only Zara could see the anticipation glittering in her eyes, the barely contained excitement of someone watching their masterpiece unfold. "Marriage is a sacred commitment," the pastor continued, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "It requires honesty, trust, and the courage to share our deepest truths with another person." Marcus's hands tightened on hers at the word honesty, and she felt rather than saw his internal struggle. Part of him wanted to confess, she realized. Part of him still loved her enough to want to stop this charade before it destroyed them both. But greed and desperation had him trapped as surely as they'd trapped her. "Before we continue with the vows," the pastor announced, "the couple has prepared special words for each other, beginning with the groom." This wasn't part of the original ceremony plan, and Zara felt her first moment of genuine surprise. Marcus released her hands and pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket, his fingers shaking as he unfolded it. "Zara," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I need to tell you something before we take this step. Something I should have said months ago." The chapel fell into absolute silence, guests leaning forward to catch every word. Brittany's confident smile faltered as she realized Marcus was going off script, potentially ruining the carefully orchestrated humiliation they'd planned. "I haven't been completely honest with you," Marcus continued, his words carrying clearly through the microphone system. "There are things about my business, about my finances, about my reasons for proposing that you deserve to know before you become my wife." A collective intake of breath swept through the congregation as the most powerful people in the world realized they were about to witness something far more dramatic than a romantic wedding. Phone cameras began recording as guests sensed scandal in the air. But before Marcus could continue his confession, the sound system crackled with interference, and suddenly Brittany's voice filled the chapel with words that weren't meant for 300 ears. "I still can't believe you got her to trust me with all those private conversations," recording her talking about her family's debts, her insecurities, her fears about not being good enough for you. It's perfect ammunition for the humiliation phase. What would you do in that moment? Expose everything publicly or handle it privately? The choice she was about to make would shock everyone in that chapel and change the course of 3 lives forever. Comment with your strategy, because what happened next was something none of them saw coming. The irony was perfect. In her eagerness to destroy Zara, Brittany had forgotten that the same technology that recorded private conversations could also broadcast them to the world. The wedding guests expected to hear, "I do." Instead, they heard, "I've been recording everything," broadcast through crystal-clear speakers. Gasps rippled through the chapel like dominoes falling as Brittany's recorded voice continued pouring from the sound system. "The plan has to work. If Zara finds out about the real financial losses before we're married, if she realizes the prenup is designed to trap her assets instead of protecting his, everything falls apart." Designer gowns rustled as society's elite processed the scandal unfolding before them. Phone cameras emerged like weapons as billionaires realized they were witnessing the story that would dominate headlines for months. The sacred chapel had transformed into a courtroom, and everyone present had become unwilling witnesses to the most public destruction of a relationship in Silicon Valley history. Marcus went pale as his own voice joined the broadcast. "She's too trusting. Zara sees the best in everyone. It's what I love about her, but it makes this easier. She'll be destroyed when she finds out, but by then it won't matter." "Oh my God!" someone whispered from the congregation, the words carrying clearly in the shocked silence. Brittany lunged toward the sound booth, her carefully styled hair coming loose as panic replaced her confident composure. "Turn it off!" she screamed at the confused technician. "Turn it off right now!" But the damage was done. 300 of the world's most connected people had just heard a detailed confession of fraud, emotional manipulation, and conspiracy. She'd lost a fairy tale, but she'd gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that she was strong enough to save herself. The woman who'd walked down the aisle as a victim was walking back up it as a victor, and this was only the beginning. She didn't just end a wedding. She dismantled an empire with evidence that proved love and business don't mix when secrets are involved. The chapel that moments before had been a temple to love transformed into a courtroom where justice wore white silk and spoke with the precision of a Harvard education. Even the flowers seemed to wilt under the weight of revealed truth as Zara stepped back to the microphone, her wedding dress trailing behind her like the robes of an avenging angel. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision, "what you've witnessed today is just the beginning. I have here documented evidence of wire fraud, investment fraud, and criminal conspiracy spanning 18 months. She pulled a thick folder from beneath her bouquet, the papers inside representing hundreds of hours of investigation that Marcus and Brittany never suspected. Mr. Chen's company has been operating with falsified revenue reports, using my family's construction business as unauthorized collateral, and planning to transfer my personal assets to cover debts totaling $2.3 billion. Gasps echoed through the congregation as investors realized the scope of the deception. The man they'd trusted with their money had been running a house of cards that was now collapsing in real time. Phone calls multiplied as financial advisors tried to assess their exposure to Chen Technologies' impending downfall. Marcus stood frozen at the altar, his expensive tuxedo making him look like a defendant in designer clothes. "Zara, please," he whispered, but his voice cracked with the knowledge that he'd already lost everything that mattered. "The FBI has been investigating Mr. Chen's financial irregularities for 3 months," Zara continued, her words landing like hammer blows. "They were waiting for additional evidence to ensure a solid case. Well, gentlemen, here's your evidence." 2 men in dark suits materialized from the back of the chapel, their badges glinting as they moved toward the altar. Brittany tried to run, her designer heels clicking frantically against marble floors, but security blocked her escape route with professional efficiency. "Brittany Walsh, you're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of privacy laws," announced Agent Richardson, the handcuffs clicking with finality around her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." "This is insane," Brittany screamed, her carefully styled hair now a mess around her tear-streaked face. "She trapped us. She made us think we were in control." "You were never in control," Zara replied with ice-cold calm. "You were just too arrogant to realize you were playing chess with someone who'd already mapped out your next 20 moves." The congregation watched in stunned silence as federal agents led Brittany away, her maid of honor dress now looking like a costume from a play that had ended badly. Marcus remained at the altar, his world crumbling around him with each passing second. "The $50 million that Mr. Wellington so generously gifted for our wedding," Zara announced, turning to address the elderly billionaire in the front row, "will now fund legal aid for women escaping relationships built on deception and financial abuse. Sometimes the most expensive gifts come with the highest price." Wellington nodded slowly, his weathered face showing approval rather than shock. "A worthy cause, my dear. Your father would be proud." As FBI agents approached Marcus with their own set of handcuffs, Zara felt something she hadn't expected, a flash of the old attraction that had started this whole nightmare. Even in his moment of complete defeat, part of her still remembered what it felt like to be held in his arms, to believe his whispered promises in the dark. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and infinitely wiser. "Marcus Chen," Agent Richardson announced. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. but I suspect your lawyers will advise you to start talking." The man who'd once commanded respect from tech giants and world leaders now stood humiliated before an audience of his peers, his empire crashing down around him like a controlled demolition. But as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked directly at Zara with something that might have been relief. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, the words carrying across the chapel with surprising clarity. "I know," she replied, and for the first time that day, her voice held something other than ice-cold rage. "When someone betrays you this deeply, is public humiliation justice or just revenge? What would you have done differently?" The line between those two things isn't always as clear as we'd like to believe. Tell me below how you'd handle discovering everything you trusted was a lie. As photographers captured every moment of the most spectacular wedding disaster in Silicon Valley history, Zara stood alone at the altar where she should have been saying, "I do." Instead, she'd said something much more powerful. She'd said, "Never again," to being anyone's victim. The fairy tale was over, but the real story was just beginning. Sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding someone else. It's about finally learning to love yourself enough to demand the truth. She walked away from $8 billion and a fairy tale life, but what she built next proved that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. 6 months after the wedding that became a trial, Zara stood in a converted warehouse in Chicago's South Side, watching fluorescent lights flicker over metal desks where dreams came to die and hope came to be reborn. The Chicago Legal Aid Clinic occupied 3,000 square feet of what used to house machinery and minimum wage jobs. Now it housed something more valuable, second chances for people who thought the system had forgotten them. "Ms. Manning, there's a reporter from the Tribune here," called Maria, her assistant, a former client who'd escaped an abusive marriage with Zara's help. "They want to interview you about the Chen Technologies settlement." Zara looked up from the case files spread across her desk, dozens of stories about women trapped by men who used money as a weapon, who hid assets and manipulated legal systems to maintain control. Each file represented someone who'd trusted the wrong person and paid a price that went far beyond money. "Tell them what I tell everyone," she replied, her voice steady with purpose. "I'm not interested in talking about the past. I'm interested in building the future." The media had turned her into a folk hero after the wedding disaster, spinning stories about the brave lawyer who'd taken down a corrupt billionaire. Magazine covers called her the bride who fought back and Silicon Valley's avenging angel. But they missed the real story. She hadn't been fighting for revenge. She'd been fighting for the right to choose her own future. Marcus's empire had collapsed within weeks of his arrest. Investors fled, board members resigned, and the company that once seemed worth billions revealed itself to be worth less than the silicon chips it was built on. The settlement money from his assets had funded this clinic and dozens of others across the country, creating a network of legal support for women facing similar battles. "You know, the old Zara would have kept that money and bought herself a new life," she murmured to herself, thinking about the woman who'd walked down that aisle 6 months ago. That woman had measured worth in dollars and designer clothes, had believed happiness could be purchased with the right ring from the right man. This Zara understood that real wealth couldn't be stolen because it came from within. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the news about the clinic's expansion. Your father would be so proud. You're helping more people than you ever could have from some mansion." The truth of those words hit her deeper than any legal victory. She'd lost a fairy tale, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that she could save herself and help others do the same. Evenings were the hardest part. That's when her body remembered what it felt like to have Marcus's arms around her, when she woke from dreams where his betrayal had never happened. The physical attraction hadn't died with the trust. If anything, losing the illusion had made the memory of genuine moments between them more painful. But she'd learned to sit with that pain without letting it define her. Loneliness was temporary. Self-respect was forever. "The Anderson case is ready for trial," Maria announced, placing another file on the growing stack. "She's nervous about testifying against her ex-husband, but the evidence is solid." Zara nodded, refocusing on the work that had become her mission. Each case was a chance to be the lawyer she'd needed 6 months ago, someone who fought for truth instead of money, who understood that justice sometimes wore work clothes and spoke with an accent. Have you ever walked away from everything comfortable to find something real? The courage that takes is incredible. To choose uncertainty over security, to bet on yourself when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Share your story of starting over, because I know some of you understand exactly what this feels like. The warehouse was quiet except for the hum of old heating systems and the distant sound of traffic. In this space that smelled like industrial cleaner and determination, she'd built something that mattered more than all of Marcus's billions combined. At 5 o'clock, she was reviewing the final case of the day when Maria's voice interrupted her concentration. "Ms. Manning, you have a visitor." She looked up, expecting to see another client, another woman whose world had been turned upside down by someone she'd trusted. Instead, she saw Marcus standing in her doorway. Not the confident billionaire in $1,000 suits, but a broken man in faded jeans who'd lost more than money. He looked different, smaller somehow, but not in a way that suggested defeat. His hands showed calluses she'd never seen before, and his hair needed cutting. The designer cologne had been replaced by the honest smell of hard work and humility. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "I came to ask how to earn it." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and a prayer. After 6 months of silence, after everything that had been destroyed and rebuilt, he'd finally said something that sounded like truth. And despite everything her logical mind knew about trust and betrayal, and the wisdom of moving forward, despite the hard-won peace she'd built in this warehouse kingdom, Zara felt something crack in the armor around her heart. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life isn't the one who lies to you. It's the one who finally decides to tell the truth. The man who once owned the world now sat in a legal aid clinic, worth 60% less, and learning that some things can't be bought, including redemption. Marcus Chen had never sat in a plastic chair before. In his previous life, furniture was custom-made leather and imported wood, designed to remind everyone who entered his space that they were in the presence of power. Now he sat in the same orange plastic chair that domestic violence survivors used when they came seeking help, his calloused hands folded in his lap like a penitent. "You look different," Zara observed, her voice carefully neutral as she studied the man across from her desk. 6 months had changed him in ways that went beyond the faded jeans and work boots. The arrogance that used to radiate from him like expensive cologne had been replaced by something she'd never seen before: genuine humility. "I've been working construction," he said, raising his hands to show the calluses and small scars that came from honest labor. "My buddy Jake, you remember him from college, he runs a crew that builds houses for Habitat for Humanity. Turns out I'm pretty good with my hands when I'm not using them to manipulate people." Zara remembered Jake Thompson, the scholarship kid from Marcus's MIT days, who'd always made her laugh with his stories about growing up in Detroit. She'd wondered how someone so genuine had stayed friends with Marcus through all the years of wealth and power. Now she understood. Jake had seen something in Marcus that had gotten buried under billions of dollars in corporate ambition. "The last 6 months have been—" Marcus paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like another performance. "They've been the most honest months of my life. When you lose everything you thought defined you, you either disappear completely or you figure out who you actually are underneath all the bullshit." "And who are you?" Zara asked, surprised by her own curiosity. She'd expected to feel only anger when she saw him again, but sitting across from this changed version of the man she'd once loved brought emotions she wasn't prepared for. "I'm someone who was so afraid of not being good enough that I made sure I never would be," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been in therapy 3 times a week since the arrest. trying to understand why I destroy everything good in my life before it can leave me first. The admission hit Zara harder than she'd expected. In all their time together, Marcus had never shown this level of self-awareness, never admitted to fears that went deeper than stock prices and board meetings. The man she'd fallen in love with had been confident to the point of arrogance. This man seemed to understand his own brokenness with painful clarity. "Dr. Martinez helped me see that I convinced myself you were too good for me from the day we met," he continued, his eyes focused on his hands rather than her face. "So I created a scenario where I'd prove myself right. If I destroyed our relationship before you could figure out I wasn't worth loving, then I could tell myself the betrayal was inevitable instead of admitting I was just too scared to trust what we had." Zara felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall she'd built around the part of her heart that had loved him. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that, but understanding. For the first time, his actions made a terrible kind of sense. "The money's gone," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "Most of it, anyway. After the settlements and legal fees and restitution, I've got about what a normal person might have in their 401k. The house is gone, the cars, the plane, all of it. And you know what the strangest part is?" "What?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I sleep better now than I have in years. Turns out carrying that many secrets is exhausting." The man sitting in her clinic bore little resemblance to the billionaire who'd proposed to her under Tuscan stars. That man had been performing even in his most intimate moments, always calculating the effect of his words and actions. This man seemed to have abandoned performance entirely in favor of raw honesty. "Do you believe people can truly change, or do you think our core nature remains the same? When someone has hurt you deeply, what would it take for you to listen?" The questions were becoming personal for Zara in ways she hadn't expected. "I donated $2 billion to organizations like this one," Marcus said, gesturing around the clinic. "Not as some grand gesture to win you back, but because seeing what you built here made me realize how I should have been using my resources all along. Money was never supposed to be a weapon or a shield. It was supposed to be a tool for building something that mattered." "Why are you telling me this?" Zara asked, her professional instincts warring with emotions she'd thought were safely buried. "Because I've spent 6 months learning why I sabotage everything good in my life," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "And I wanted you to know that losing you was the wake-up call I needed to become someone worth knowing." The words hung between them like a bridge across 6 months of silence and pain. Zara felt herself at a crossroads she hadn't expected to face, between the safety of her new life and the dangerous possibility of believing that people could fundamentally change. "What did you discover?" she heard herself ask, the question escaping before her logical mind could stop it. His answer would test everything she thought she knew about forgiveness, about second chances, about whether love could survive the death of illusion. And despite every warning bell in her head, she found herself genuinely wanting to hear what he'd learned in the ruins of their fairy tale. The most honest conversation of their relationship happened after it was over, when pretense died and only raw truth remained. Rain drummed against the clinic windows as they sat across from each other at her desk, two people who'd shared a bed but had never been this naked with each other. The storm outside matched the emotional weather between them, turbulent but somehow cleansing, washing away the remnants of who they used to be. "Dr. Martinez asked me a question that broke me completely," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the intensity of his words. "She asked me to describe the moment I knew I loved you, really loved you, not just the idea of you or what you represented." Zara found herself leaning forward despite her better judgment, drawn into the vulnerability she'd never seen from him before. During their engagement, his emotions had always felt calculated, delivered at precisely the right moment for maximum effect. This rawness was entirely new. "It was that night in your apartment when you got food poisoning from the sketchy Thai place," he continued, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You were so sick you couldn't keep anything down, and I held your hair back while you threw up and told you terrible jokes to make you laugh between waves of nausea. She remembered that night, 3 months into their relationship, before the private jets and luxury hotels, when they were still discovering each other in small, ordinary moments. She'd been embarrassed to be seen at her most human, but Marcus had stayed without being asked, bringing her ice chips and bad movies until she felt better. "You looked at me like I was a hero for doing something any decent person would do," he said, his voice catching slightly. "And I realized I'd spent my whole life being praised for achievements and acquisitions, but no one had ever looked at me like I mattered just for being kind. That's when I knew I loved you, not the successful lawyer or the society connections or any of the things I told myself mattered. I loved the woman who saw something worth loving in a guy bringing her ginger ale at 3 a.m. The memory hit Zara like a physical blow because she remembered that look, remembered thinking that Marcus Chen, billionaire tech mogul who could have anyone, had chosen to spend his night taking care of her when she was at her most unglamorous. It had been the moment she'd let herself believe the fairy tale might be real. "So why did you try to destroy it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I didn't believe I deserved it," he replied with devastating honesty. "I'd built my entire identity around being smarter, richer, more successful than everyone else. But with you, none of that mattered. You loved me for qualities I wasn't sure I actually possessed. What if you figured out I was just a scared kid from San Francisco who got lucky with some code and a good marketing team?" The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Marcus laid bare the insecurities that had driven him to sabotage the best thing in his life. Zara found herself seeing their entire relationship through a different lens, not as a calculated deception, but as the desperate actions of someone who'd never learned to believe he was worthy of genuine love. "The betrayal with Brittany," he continued, his voice heavy with shame, "that wasn't about wanting her. It was about creating a situation so unforgivable that you'd have to leave me. Then I could tell myself it was inevitable instead of admitting I was too terrified to trust what we had." "But the financial fraud," Zara said, her lawyer's mind still processing the scope of his deception. "The plans to steal my inheritance, that went way beyond self-sabotage." Marcus's face darkened with genuine remorse. "That was panic. When the company started failing and I realized how much debt I'd hidden from everyone, including myself, I convinced myself that your money could save everything. I told myself I was protecting our future, but really I was just too proud to admit I'd failed." The intellectual and emotional intimacy of this conversation felt more dangerous than any physical attraction they'd ever shared. This version of Marcus, broken but honest, vulnerable but not manipulative, was more appealing than the confident billionaire had ever been, and that terrified her. "I spent months in therapy learning about attachment styles and trauma patterns," he said, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Turns out, when your father abandons the family when you're 8 and your mother spends the rest of your childhood telling you that you have to be perfect or people will leave, you develop some pretty unhealthy coping mechanisms. Have you ever realized that the relationship you thought was perfect was actually built on avoiding difficult truths? Sometimes breaking is the only way to rebuild properly, but it requires the courage to sit in the wreckage and examine every piece." "I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did," Marcus continued. "Understanding why I hurt you doesn't undo the damage. But I wanted you to know that every single day for the past 6 months, I've been working to become someone who could love you the way you deserved to be loved from the beginning." Zara felt tears she'd held back for months finally spill down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but tears of grief for what they could have been if he'd been brave enough to be honest from the start. The man sitting across from her now was who she'd always hoped existed underneath the performance, but finding him after everything that had been destroyed felt like discovering buried treasure in the ruins of a burned house. "You were right," she said, her voice breaking. "I was too good for the man you were. The question is, who are you now?" The answer would determine if love could survive the death of illusion, if trust could be rebuilt from the ground up, If two people could find their way back to each other through the wreckage of everything they'd thought they knew about themselves. Marcus looked at her with eyes that held no trace of the arrogance or calculation she remembered, only the raw hope of someone who'd lost everything and discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what actually matters. "I'm someone who's finally ready to love you honestly," he said, "even if it's too late." She didn't want his money or his promises. She wanted something harder to give, consistent action over time that proved change was real. 3 months later, Zara found herself looking forward to Monday mornings for the first time since the wedding disaster. Not because her work had changed. The legal aid clinic still buzzed with the controlled chaos of people fighting for their futures, but because Mondays meant Marcus would be there, arriving at 7 sharp with coffee for the entire staff and calluses from his weekend construction work. "He's here," Maria announced with barely concealed amusement as Marcus's beat-up Honda pulled into the parking lot. The woman who'd once been terrified of her abusive ex-husband now took perverse pleasure in watching a former billionaire navigate the complexities of earning trust through action rather than money. Zara watched through her office window as Marcus unloaded supplies for the community garden they'd started behind the clinic. What had begun as a practical solution for unused space had become something neither of them expected, a place where things grew slowly, patiently, requiring consistent care and attention to thrive. "Morning, boss," he called as he passed her window, his arms full of tomato seedlings and organic soil. He'd never addressed her that way during their engagement, when his own empire had dwarfed her legal practice. Now he seemed genuinely comfortable taking direction from the woman he'd once tried to control. The community garden bloomed with unexpected beauty, vegetables growing in soil that had been contaminated for decades, proof that even the most damaged ground could nurture new life if tended with patience and care. Clients from the clinic worked alongside volunteers, their hands dirty with honest work that had nothing to do with legal battles or past trauma. "Mrs. Rodriguez's custody case is solid," Marcus said, appearing in her doorway with dirt under his fingernails and sweat on his forehead. "I reviewed the financial documents like you asked. Her ex-husband has been hiding assets in his mother's name, but the paper trail is clear enough for a conviction. He'd been volunteering at the clinic for 3 months without any expectation of reconciliation, using his business background to help unravel the financial abuse that so often accompanied domestic violence. The man who'd once hidden his own assets had become an expert at finding where other abusers stashed their money." "Thank you," Zara said, accepting the file without the wariness that had marked their early interactions. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped waiting for him to revert to his old patterns and started trusting the evidence of consistent change. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the papers, and she felt the familiar jolt of electricity that had always existed between them. But now it was complicated by something deeper, the attraction that came from genuine respect rather than surface chemistry. "The Hartwell case goes to trial next week," she said, focusing on business to avoid the dangerous territory of personal feelings. "Are you sure you want to testify about your own financial manipulation tactics? It won't be comfortable." "Comfortable isn't the goal," Marcus replied, his voice steady with purpose. "If my experience can help put another abuser behind bars, then maybe some good can come from the damage I caused." The difference between someone saying they'd changed and actually proving it, Zara had learned, was measured in moments like these, when doing the right thing came at personal cost, when no one was watching or keeping score, when the only reward was the knowledge that yesterday's mistakes might prevent someone else's tomorrow. What's the difference between someone saying they've changed and actually proving it? How long would you need to see consistent change before believing it was real? Zara had started with a timeline of forever, convinced that trust once broken could never be fully repaired. But watching Marcus work beside her day after day, she'd begun to wonder if she'd been protecting herself from possibility as much as from pain. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "I've been offered a position in London. Habitat for Humanity wants me to head their international development program." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she couldn't quite understand why. They weren't together. They'd never discussed a future beyond his volunteer work at the clinic. She had no claim on his time or his choices, but the thought of him leaving felt like losing something she'd only just begun to recognize she valued. "When would you leave?" she asked, trying to keep her voice professionally neutral, even as panic crept up her throat. "That depends," he said, stepping closer to her desk, "on whether you think there's any reason for me to stay." The question hung between them like a bridge across 6 months of careful distance, 3 months of slowly rebuilt trust, and countless moments when she'd caught herself wondering if love could exist in the aftermath of betrayal. Not the naive love that had led her down the aisle toward disaster, but something harder and more honest. Love that had survived the worst and chosen to keep growing anyway. Her reaction surprised her more than it surprised him. After months of careful professional distance, of treating him like any other volunteer, of convincing herself that what they'd once had was dead and buried, she felt the truth rise in her throat like a confession. The panic in her voice revealed feelings she'd been hiding even from herself when she heard herself say, "Don't go." And in those 2 words, she realized that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't walking away from someone who's hurt you. It's choosing to believe that people can change, that love can be stronger than fear, that some things are worth the risk of being broken again. Sometimes you don't realize how much someone has changed until you face the possibility of losing them again. This time by their choice, not their betrayal. The Chicago skyline glittered like scattered stars as they sat on the clinic's rooftop, the city sprawling beneath them like all the possibilities they were afraid to name. The wind carried the scent of approaching autumn, change in the air, inevitable as seasons. Zara pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from the sudden awareness that everything was about to shift again. "London's a good opportunity," she said, her voice carefully neutral as she stared out at the lights. "Habitat for Humanity International is serious work. You'd be helping build homes for families around the world." Marcus sat beside her on the concrete ledge, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but far enough away to respect the boundaries they'd carefully constructed over months of rebuilding trust. His hands rested on his knees, those calloused fingers that had learned to build instead of destroy, to give instead of take. "It is good work," he agreed quietly. "But so is what we're doing here. These women, these families, they need people who understand what it's like to have everything fall apart and have to rebuild from nothing." The admission hung between them like a confession. For months he'd been careful not to pressure her, not to assume that his volunteer work at the clinic meant anything beyond his desire to make amends. But now, faced with the possibility of leaving, the truth was harder to hide. "Marcus," she said, turning to face him for the first time since they'd climbed up here, "what are we doing, really?" The question she'd been avoiding for 3 months finally escaped, carrying all the fear and hope she'd been trying to ignore. They worked together beautifully, complemented each other's strengths, shared the same passion for justice and healing. But working together wasn't the same as being together, and she'd been too scared to examine what lay beneath their careful professional partnership. "I don't know," he replied with the honesty that had replaced his old need to have all the answers. "I know I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. I know seeing you build something this meaningful makes me prouder than any business deal I ever closed. And I know that losing you the first time nearly destroyed me, but losing you again, even to protect your peace, might finish the job." His vulnerability hit her like a physical blow. The old Marcus would have turned this conversation into a negotiation, would have presented logical arguments for why she should want him to stay. This Marcus simply told her the truth and left the choice in her hands. "I never expected to feel this way again," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the city noise below. "After everything that happened, I thought that part of me was gone forever. I thought love was something that happened to naive people who didn't know better." "And now?" he asked, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights like mirrors. "Now I think maybe love is something that happens to brave people who do know better, but choose to try anyway. The space between them seemed to shrink as she spoke, magnetic pull drawing them closer despite every rational reason to maintain distance. When Marcus reached up to touch her face, his hand shook slightly, not from desire but from the overwhelming gratitude of being trusted with her vulnerability again. "Zara," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "Are you sure about this? About us? Because if we do this, if we try again, I need you to know that I'm all in. No games, no backup plans, no exit strategies, just me, exactly as I am now, loving you exactly as you are now." The kiss that followed started gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid the other might disappear. But as Zara felt the familiar electricity that had always existed between them, now deepened by everything they'd survived, she pulled back suddenly, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't," she breathed, panic rising in her chest. "What if you change your mind again? What if this is just another phase and in 6 months you decide I'm not worth the effort?" Marcus stepped back immediately, his hands dropping to his sides in a gesture of respectful retreat that somehow made her want him more than any pursuit ever could have. The old Marcus would have pressed his advantage, would have used her moment of weakness to push for what he wanted. This Marcus simply nodded and gave her space to breathe. "You're right to be scared," he said, his voice steady despite the disappointment she could see in his eyes. "I broke your trust in the most public way possible. Saying I've changed and proving it over time are two different things. You get to set the pace here, Zara. You get to decide if and when you're ready to risk your heart again. When someone has hurt you deeply but proven they've changed, how do you choose between protecting yourself and taking a chance on love?" The decision hanging between them wasn't just about romance. It was about whether healing meant building walls or learning to love from a place of strength instead of need. As he stood to leave, accepting her need for space without argument or manipulation, Zara felt something crack open in her chest. This man who'd once been willing to destroy her to protect himself was now willing to walk away to protect her healing. The growth wasn't just in his words, it was in his actions, his patience, his willingness to love her enough to let her choose freely. "Marcus," she called as he reached the rooftop door. When he turned, the words that came out weren't planned, weren't safe, but they were true. "I don't want you to go to London." The vulnerability in her voice hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. But as autumn wind swirled around them and the city sparkled below, Zara realized that sometimes the greatest risk isn't opening your heart again, it's keeping it closed when something real is standing right in front of you. She'd spent months learning to live without him. Now she had to decide if she wanted to choose him not from need, but from the terrifying freedom of genuine choice. Her apartment had become a sanctuary of independence, every piece of furniture chosen for her alone. The second-hand couch where she'd cried herself to sleep after the wedding disaster. The small dining table where she'd eaten countless meals in solitude, learning to enjoy her own company. The bookshelf filled with legal texts and novels she'd finally had time to read without someone demanding her attention. Inviting him in wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about consciously choosing to share a space she'd learned to love in solitude. "Coffee?" she offered, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the door. 3 days had passed since their rooftop conversation, 3 days of her thinking about nothing but the choice in front of her. Stay safe in the life she'd built, or risk everything on the possibility that love could work when both people chose it from wholeness instead of need. "Please," Marcus said, stepping into her small living room and looking around with genuine appreciation. "It's beautiful, Zara. It feels like you." The space was tiny compared to the mansion they'd planned to share, filled with thrift store finds and personal touches that money couldn't buy. But it was hers in a way that luxury never had been, chosen and arranged by someone who finally knew who she was without trying to impress anyone else. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, settling onto the couch and watching him take the chair across from her. Even now, he was careful about boundaries, refusing to assume physical closeness until she invited it. About being all in, no backup plans. "And?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite the hope she could see in his eyes. "I realized I've been protecting myself from the wrong thing," she said, her words coming slowly as she worked through thoughts that had kept her awake for 3 nights. "I've been so afraid of being hurt again that I forgot to ask myself what I actually wanted. Not what was safe, not what made sense, but what would make me happy." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her words. The old version of him would have been calculating his response, planning his next move in the conversation. This version simply listened with the patience of someone who'd learned that love couldn't be rushed or manipulated. "I want to try," she said, the words carrying the weight of every fear she was choosing to face. "Not because I need you to complete me or fix my life, but because I want to see what we could build together when we're both choosing from strength instead of desperation." The smile that spread across his face was unlike anything she'd ever seen from him. Pure joy, without calculation, gratitude without agenda. When he stood and moved toward the couch, she didn't pull back. When he sat beside her and reached for her hands, she let him take them. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Because once we cross this line, once we decide to rebuild instead of just surviving, there's no going back to the safety of distance." "I'm not the same woman who walked down that aisle," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "And you're not the same man who left me there. Let's see who we are now." The kiss this time was different from their tentative moment on the rooftop. This was a conscious choice, a deliberate step into unknown territory with someone she was choosing to trust with her rebuilt heart. When Marcus's hands moved to frame her face, she didn't pull away. When she deepened the kiss, exploring the familiar territory of his mouth with new understanding, he responded with reverence that took her breath away. "Zara," he breathed against her lips, his voice rough with emotion and desire that had been held in check for months. "I love you. Not the woman I thought you should be, not the fantasy I created in my head, but exactly who you are right now, in this moment." "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "The real you, the one who builds houses and grows gardens and shows up every day to prove that change is possible." When he touched her face, his hands shook slightly, not from desire, but from gratitude. The old Marcus had taken her love for granted, had assumed it would always be there no matter how he behaved. This Marcus understood that love was a gift to be treasured, not a right to be expected. Their movement to her bedroom was slow, deliberate, marked by conversations between kisses about boundaries and desires, about what this meant and where they wanted it to lead. The woman who'd once been swept away by grand gestures now insisted on conscious choice at every step. What does it mean to choose someone not because you need them, but because you want to build something together from a place of wholeness? The question hung in the air between them as clothes disappeared and skin touched skin, as they rediscovered each other with new awareness of what they'd almost lost forever. "This is better," she whispered against his neck as he moved above her, their bodies finding the rhythm they'd never forgotten, but now understood in an entirely new way. "This is real." Afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like her independence and their shared future, Zara felt peace she hadn't experienced since before that devastating morning 6 months ago. Not the peace of avoiding pain, but the peace of choosing love, despite the possibility of pain. Marcus's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when he reached for it, his body went rigid against hers. The contentment on his face shifted to something darker, more complicated. "What is it?" she asked, propping herself up on her elbow to see his face. His answer changed everything. "Brittany's been released from prison, and she's asking to meet with you." The past, it seemed, wasn't done with them yet, but as Zara felt Marcus's arms tighten around her protectively, she realized she was no longer the same woman who could be destroyed by someone else's jealousy and manipulation. Some battles were worth fighting, and some demons needed to be faced to truly move forward. The woman who'd tried to destroy her life wanted to meet for coffee, and Zara's response would prove that sometimes the best revenge is living well. The coffee shop buzzed with ordinary life while two women sat across from each other, separated by a small table and a chasm of betrayal that 2 years couldn't bridge. Brittany looked smaller somehow, prison having stripped away the Instagram filter from her reality. Her designer clothes had been replaced by department store basics, her perfect makeup by the tired face of someone who'd learned that consequences were real. "Thank you for coming," Brittany said, her voice lacking the confident edge that had once commanded attention at every social gathering. "I wasn't sure you would." Zara studied the woman who'd been her best friend since college, searching for traces of the person she'd once trusted with her deepest secrets. Brittany's hands shook slightly as she lifted her coffee cup, and her eyes held the desperate quality of someone trying to rebuild a life from nothing. "I almost didn't," Zara replied honestly. "But I've learned that avoiding difficult conversations doesn't make them go away. It just gives them power over you." The transformation in Zara was evident in everything from her posture to her tone. The woman who'd once been devastated by betrayal now sat with the calm confidence of someone who'd survived the worst and discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Prison might have changed Brittany, but freedom had transformed Zara into someone impossible to manipulate. "I owe you an apology," Brittany began, her rehearsed words tumbling out in a rush. "What I did was unforgivable. I was jealous and bitter, and I convinced myself that destroying your happiness would somehow make me feel better about my own life." "You're right," Zara said simply. "It was unforgivable. So why are we here?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Brittany off guard. She'd probably expected tears, drama, some emotional response that would give her an opening to manipulate the situation. Instead, she faced someone who'd moved far beyond the need for her validation or explanation. "I wanted to explain," Brittany said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I wanted you to understand why I did what I did. We were best friends, Zara. That has to count for something." "We were," Zara agreed, her voice steady and emotionless. "But the woman who was my best friend wouldn't have tried to destroy my life for money. You made your choices, Brittany. Now you get to live with the consequences." The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Brittany cycling through apologies, explanations, and barely veiled attempts to rewrite history in her favor. She talked about her own childhood trauma, her financial pressures, her jealousy of Zara's success. Each excuse was met with polite but implacable calm from the woman she'd tried to break. "I was jealous of everything you had," Brittany finally admitted, tears streaming down her face as her composure cracked completely. "But mostly I was jealous of how he looked at you, like you were magic." The admission might have hurt the old Zara, might have opened wounds that had barely healed, but this Zara felt something unexpected: pity. Not for Brittany's circumstances, but for someone who'd been so focused on tearing others down that she'd never learned to build herself up. "He looks at me that way now because I finally see my own magic too," Zara replied, standing and gathering her purse. "I hope someday you find yours, Brittany, but you won't find it by trying to take mine." "Would you meet with someone who betrayed you if they asked for closure? Sometimes facing our demons is the only way to truly move forward, but sometimes the most powerful response is refusing to let their drama become your story." Walking away from that coffee shop, Zara felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The woman who'd once had the power to devastate her with a few cruel words now seemed small and sad, trapped in a prison of her own making even after her release. Marcus waited outside, leaning against his Honda with the patient posture of someone who'd learned to trust without controlling. When he saw her emerge, his face searched hers for signs of damage, ready to offer comfort or space, or whatever she needed. "How do you feel?" he asked as she reached him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Free," she said, the word carrying surprise even to her own ears. I thought seeing her would bring back all the anger and hurt, but instead it just reminded me how far I've come. The woman who could be destroyed by Brittany Walsh doesn't exist anymore. The realization was profound in its simplicity. The best revenge wasn't elaborate schemes or public humiliation. It was becoming so thoroughly yourself that other people's opinions became irrelevant. It was building a life so authentic and fulfilling that attacks from the outside couldn't touch its foundation. She wanted closure, Zara continued as Marcus opened the car door for her. But closure isn't something someone else can give you. It's something you create by choosing to move forward, regardless of whether they deserve your forgiveness. As they drove through Chicago traffic toward the life they were building together, Zara realized the most powerful revenge was becoming impossible to destroy. Not because she'd built walls, but because she'd built herself into someone strong enough to weather any storm. The past had finally lost its power over her future, and that, she thought, was worth more than any apology Brittany could have offered. The second proposal happened in her tiny apartment, with a simple ring, and a man who'd learned that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up every day and meaning it. Her one-bedroom apartment had never felt small until Marcus knelt beside her second-hand couch, the simple solitaire in his hands, catching light from the discount lamp she'd bought at a thrift store. This time, luxury wasn't the point. Authenticity was. The ring was modest by his old standards, probably worth less than the wine he used to order with dinner, but it had been chosen with care for a woman who valued meaning over money. "I know this isn't what you expected the first time," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness she could see in his eyes. "No private jets or Italian villas or photographers hiding in the bushes to capture the perfect moment. Just me, asking you to build a life together in whatever way feels right to both of us." Zara looked down at him from her position on the couch. This man who'd learned humility the hard way, who'd discovered that real love couldn't be bought or staged or performed for an audience. The apartment around them told the story of her journey, from the woman who'd needed a fairy tale to the one who'd learned to write her own story. "The first proposal was about what you thought I wanted," she said, reaching down to touch his face. "This one is about who we actually are." "I don't have billions anymore," Marcus continued, his honesty carrying more weight than any grand gesture ever could. "I can't promise you mansions or private islands or any of the things I used to think mattered. What I can promise is that I'll show up every day and choose you every day and work every day to be worthy of the trust you're giving me." The ring itself was perfect in its simplicity, a single diamond in a classic setting, sized exactly right because he'd paid attention to her preferences over months of working together, not the showpiece engagement ring that had been designed to impress others, but something meant for daily wear by a woman who worked with her hands and didn't need jewelry to announce her worth. "Marcus," she said, sliding off the couch to kneel beside him on the floor they'd refinished together. "The first time you proposed, I said yes because I thought I was supposed to. This time I'm saying yes because I want to." The kiss that followed tasted like tears and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from making choices from strength instead of fear. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like coming home to herself and to him simultaneously. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "Not because you complete me, but because you challenge me to be complete myself." What makes a proposal meaningful, the ring size or the heart behind it? When someone proves they've changed, how do you celebrate without forgetting the lessons learned? For Zara and Marcus, the answer lay in honoring both their journey and their destination. They made love on the couch where she'd cried over him, in the apartment where she'd rebuilt herself from nothing. The space that had been her refuge became their celebration, every familiar surface now holding new memories of choosing each other consciously. "This is better," she breathed as he moved above her, their bodies finding the rhythm of people who'd learned to trust again. "This is real." Afterward, as they lay tangled in the throw blanket she'd bought during her lowest moments, Zara felt the deep satisfaction of a choice made from wisdom instead of wishful thinking. This engagement felt nothing like the first one. No champagne or photographers, no designer dress or elaborate plans. Just two people who'd survived the worst and decided to risk the best. "We should talk about practical things," Marcus said, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Prenups and financial arrangements and all the boring stuff that lawyers insist on." "Already drafted," Zara replied with a laugh. "Did you think I'd make the same mistake twice? This time we both go in with our eyes wide open and our assets clearly defined." The conversation that followed would have been impossible during their first engagement, when love was supposed to conquer all and practical considerations seemed unromantic. Now they discussed money and expectations and future goals with the honesty of people who'd learned that love worked best when it was built on truth. "I want to expand the clinic," Zara said as they planned their future. "Open branches in other cities, create a network of legal aid specifically for women escaping financial abuse." "And I want to help," Marcus replied, "not as the rich boyfriend funding your charity, but as a partner in the mission. We could be good at this together." As she said yes to a future built on truth instead of fantasy, Zara realized they had one more choice to make: how to honor the pain that had taught them to value love properly. The idea that came to her would surprise everyone who thought they knew their story, but it felt right in a way that fairy tale endings never had. Sometimes the most romantic gesture isn't grand or expensive. It's the simple act of choosing each other every day, even when no one is watching, especially when the choice is hard. 1 year after the wedding that ended in betrayal, they stood before 30 people who'd watched them break and rebuild, proving that sometimes love needs to die before it can truly live. The community garden behind the clinic bloomed with late summer abundance as they exchanged vows under a simple arch of sunflowers and morning glories. The guests were clients who'd become family, volunteers who'd witnessed their journey, and Judge Patricia Williams, who'd agreed to officiate, legally this time, emotionally for real. No tech moguls or society photographers, no crystal chandeliers or designer gowns. Just the people who mattered most, celebrating love that had survived its own death and been reborn stronger. "Friends," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying across the small gathering with warm authority, "we're here today not to witness the beginning of a love story, but to celebrate its rebirth. Marcus and Zara have already learned the hardest lesson of marriage, that love is a choice made daily, not a feeling that sustains itself." Zara stood in a simple white dress she'd bought off the rack, her bouquet picked that morning from the very garden where they now stood. Marcus wore a navy suit he'd owned for years, his wedding ring, a simple gold band that matched hers, catching the afternoon sunlight. Everything about this ceremony spoke to who they'd become, rather than who they'd once tried to be. "Marcus," Judge Williams continued, "your vows." He turned to face Zara fully, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Zara, the first time I proposed, I was trying to convince you to accept a fantasy. Today, I'm asking you to build a reality. I promise to choose growth over comfort, honesty over convenience, and love over fear, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." His voice cracked slightly on the final words, carrying the weight of everything they'd survived. The guests, women who'd escaped abusive marriages, volunteers who'd seen the worst of human nature, lawyers who'd fought impossible battles, understood better than any society crowd what those promises meant. "I promise to love you not because you complete me, but because you challenge me to complete myself," Marcus continued. "To be your partner in building something that matters more than what we own or what others think of us. To show up every day and mean it." When Zara spoke her vows, her voice carried the strength of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment. "Marcus, you taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone committed to growing. Today I choose you, not because you complete me, but because you inspire me to be complete myself." The ceremony lasted 20 minutes, but every word carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. When Judge Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like forgiveness and hope, and the kind of love that can only exist after illusions die. The reception was potluck in the clinic's main room, decorated with flowers from their garden, and photos documenting the journey from betrayal to renewal. Maria gave a toast about watching two broken people help fix each other by fixing themselves first. Jake Thompson, Marcus's construction buddy, joked about how manual labor had finally taught his friend the value of honest work. "So what would you do if someone who betrayed you came back genuinely changed?" Zara asked the assembled crowd during her own toast. "Would you take the risk? Would you build something new from the ruins of what was broken? We're here tonight because sometimes the answer is yes, but only when both people do the work to become worthy of that yes." As evening fell and their small celebration wound down, Marcus carried Zara over the threshold of the apartment they now shared. It felt different than possession. It felt like coming home to themselves and each other. "No regrets?" he asked as he slowly removed her simple wedding dress, his hands reverent on fabric that had cost less than his old ties but meant infinitely more. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she breathed, pulling him into the life they'd built from ashes. Their wedding night was passionate but unhurried, marked by the deep intimacy of people who'd learned to see each other clearly. No grand gestures or expensive lingerie, just two people celebrating a love that had survived its own destruction and emerged transformed. "In 5 years," Zara whispered as they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like their shared future, "when people ask about our love story, what will we tell them?" "The truth," Marcus replied, his arm tightening around her. "That sometimes you have to lose everything to find what actually matters. That love isn't about the wedding. It's about what you build in all the days after." If this story of redemption and real love touched your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are possible when people do the real work of change. Tell me in the comments, do you believe people can truly transform? Would you take the risk on love after betrayal if someone proved they genuinely changed? And remember, beautiful souls, the strongest love isn't built on perfection, but on the courage to grow through imperfection together. Sometimes our greatest heartbreaks lead to our greatest transformations, and sometimes the fairy tale we thought we wanted pales in comparison to the real love we never knew we needed. This is Mr. Daniel, and this has been your story of second chances and real love. Until next time, keep believing in the magic of becoming who you're meant to be.